The body is not incidental in theology, it's actually central in theology.
Jonathan Haidt released the book, The Anxious Generation, in the spring of 2024, and it's become a New York Times bestseller. And in those months, we've seen a lot of conversation about that in culture, and even to the point of school districts taking steps to implement some ideas found in what he's raising in this book about the dangers of phone-based childhood.
Talk to us just a little bit as a theologian, right? So obviously we all find social psychology interesting because it interacts with our daily life, but what are some takeaways for you as you think about this from more of a theological perspective that you found interesting?
Yeah, and so Haidt's an atheist, and he's very open about that. But one of the things that's really interesting, maybe even a little bit odd in the book, is he lays out, here's the problem, and it has two parts. The first part of the problem is that parents, because of kind of helicopter parenting and being worried about safety, have not allowed their kids to have a play-based childhood, kind of overprotected them in the real world, tried to nerf the world, so to speak, and then underprotected them in the digital world. And so that's the problem. But he thinks the solution is partly in reclaiming what he calls ancient spiritual practices that produce health, mental health and physical health and communal health. And as an atheist, I found that interesting that I'm not an atheist, just to be clear, but I find that interesting that that's what he's advocating for, even though he doesn't believe in God. He sees it as a kind of placebo button, that even if you don't believe, that these practices bring health. And so I actually disagree. I think belief is important, and I don't want to treat faith like a placebo button. But it also creates a kind of a bridge and a place of contact between people like me who are interested in those spiritual practices and people like him who are interested in the social psychology part of things. I'm also interested in it because I think Christians have not really been able to think and talk well about this issue, especially evangelicals. And the reason is you can't find a Bible verse about smartphones. And so there's not one on Instagram. Paul doesn't say, thou shalt not TikTok or anything like that. And so as evangelicals, if the way we think Christianly is just to reach for a proof text that we can kind of put on a coffee mug or a t-shirt, we're not really going to have anything to say about this because there's not a proof text for smartphones and social media. And so that is a place where I think theologians can offer something and say, what if we didn't just look for a Bible verse about smartphones? What if we thought about Christian doctrines that can help us to think faithfully and biblically about some of these issues? And so we can talk more about that if you want, but I think the doctrine of creation, how God made us as embodied creatures, not just brains on sticks, and how embodied community and relationship is important, but also the doctrine of the incarnation, that when God wanted to save humanity, he didn't send an idea or a message or even a letter. He sent an enfleshed human who was also fully divine. And so I think if we think about this topic in terms of doctrines and not just in terms of proof texts, then we can actually have something to say that matters on a really, really important issue.
Yeah, you spoke in chapel recently on the book of 2 John, which I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on 2 John before.
Same.
But you kind of talked about some of those themes, some of those doctrinal themes in that message. Can you pull out a couple of those as it relates to what Jonathan Haidt is saying?
Yeah, so 2 John is great because it's so short. We read the whole book in chapel and it took about 30 seconds. And so especially for maybe a TikTok generation, 2 John is where it's at. But it has kind of two parts that I think are interesting for this. One of the things is that John is confronting what comes to be known later as the heresy of Gnosticism, which is the idea that Jesus didn't really come in the flesh. And that was kind of shameful for a lot of ancient people to believe that God would take on human flesh. God would, experience death, weakness, hunger, the need for rest. And so it was much easier to believe in a salvation that was not by way of the incarnation, but was by way of knowledge And so gnosis means knowledge, Gnosticism. And so what John is advocating for is the importance of embodiment, an embodied, enfleshed God, the incarnation.
Yeah.
And then tagging on to that, he does something really interesting at the very end of his letter, and he also does this in 3rd John. He says in 2nd John, there are many things I want to write to you, but I do not want to use paper and ink.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 3rd John, also a short letter, he says, I have many things I want to write to you, but I don't want to use pen and ink. And so it's his way of saying, man, I've got a lot to say. It's really important. And so I'm not going to say it with just letters on a page or text on a screen. I want to be in the same room with you and communicate these things to my people the way that Jesus did to his people, which was in an embodied way.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really interesting, that the main danger that he is pointing out is this virtual gospel called Gnosticism. The idea that embodiment doesn't matter, physical presence doesn't matter. It's just ideas that matter. You're saved by knowledge. That's Gnosticism. And his solution mirrors the solution that Jesus provides, which is embodied presence. I want to be with you. And I think we see other places in Scripture where writers, even though they're using a letter, which is kind of like cool new technology, in the ancient world, Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, he says, see with what large letters I write this greeting with my own hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's super interesting because he's using a scribe, an amanuensis, somebody he dictates to, because apparently maybe this guy has better penmanship than Paul or something, But then Paul says, wait a minute, right here at this part, I want to write with really large letters with my own hand. And we don't know why. Maybe Paul had poor penmanship. Maybe he had a physical ailment that caused him to have to write with large letters. But he is wanting to attach his words in this letter to his hand, his body physically, because he knows that a sense of physicality and embodied presence is important in relationships. The body is not incidental in theology. It's actually central in theology. So those are just a few passages. We don't have passages on smartphones, but we have resources in the Scriptures and in theology that can help us to think about why the stuff Haidt is saying actually lines up with Scripture and Christian tradition.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
I'm curious to know what you might think about why it is that it seems that our guard has been down about the use of these technologies and mobile technologies so much, when it seems like maybe the church with these theological resources might have been maybe more wary of these kind of mediums that detach people, or sometimes even allow you to create an image of yourself that's not accurate to who you are. And a big part of connected to that trend of, for teen girls especially, the anxiety and the body image issues that fuel so many negative things, having to do with that kind of false portrayal. Why do you think that is that we haven't been as in touch with these resources?
I think one reason we said already is it's not like a sin issue, right? And so we don't have a Bible verse that says don't use Instagram. And so this isn't kind of like an anti-technology screed. It's just a request that we think Christianly and live wisely with regard to technology. And so I think another reason why evangelicals have probably been particularly poor in this is, I've heard the phrase, well, and this, I get this, I'm not trying to smash it, but it's just a tool. It's just a tool, smartphone, social media. It's just a tool, right? And if I were going to change one part of that sentence, it would be the word just. Because the word just, if we're just going to analyze the idea, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. But it's not at all clear to me that it's an accurate statement, right? So tools are not all sort of equally formative versus deformative, right? Not all uses are, so it doesn't make sense to view every tool as equally helpful just because it's a tool. So I'd take the word just out and say, it's a tool. But whether you club your neighbor over the head with that hammer or hit a nail with it, That's important. And so I do think that it's perfectly fine to say, yeah, and some tools are a lot more dangerous than others because we're embodied creatures and dopamine's a real thing. And some tools were actually specifically engineered to get money out of you, right?
Right.
By taking time and engaging physical chemical processes in your body, like the dopamine feedback loop, right? That's a physical reality. And we don't escape that by simply saying it's just a tool.
Yeah.
Like, well, you have a body,
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
tool
Exactly.
has effects.
Yeah. I've heard Jonathan Haidt even reference the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, and was famous for the statement, the medium is the message. That it's not just a way to communicate a message, but in itself, it communicates something.
Yeah.
Like, it kind of connects to what you're saying about being mindful of that.
Yeah, we say a lot of times, and I get what we mean by this. We say, look, our methods will change, but our message never will, right? But what McLuhan is saying is that's a pipe dream.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That doesn't mean your method shouldn't change,
Sure.
right? Don't mishear me. Like, I'm using a microphone and not a scribe like
Right.
Paul was. But what McLuhan is saying is every change in medium carries with it implicit messaging. So a stained glass window, the messaging is different than a big screen on the wall. So doesn't mean your methods can't change. It just means that it is false to say that methods and message are divorced or
completely separate.
Like they are. And the biggest proof for that is the incarnation.
Yeah.
Right?
You're right.
That the method and the message were intertwined through we call it the hypostatic union, right? To use a big theological term. That you don't just get to sever those as if they don't have any relation to one another. And I think maybe that's another reason why some Christian traditions haven't done as well. We've built up this myth that you can separate method and message, and that things are just tools. They're always neutrally sort of formative. And I don't think that's true.
And this tool is something that we can and should use to advance the gospel or advance the kingdom, that we should get involved as soon as possible to
sometimes it is,
manipulate these.
sometimes it's not.
Right.
I think sometimes there's a kind of ends versus means thing going on where we're like, well, the end is this, so we're going to embrace any means necessary to get there. And like, well, if you're super depressed and you're addicted to your phone and you know what I mean? Like, I don't know that justifies that choice. So those are things we need to think about, and maybe in more complex and biblical ways than sometimes we do.